Welcome to Bedtime Legends. Tonight, our journey carries us far from the halls of emperors and the roads of great kingdoms into a quieter place. A place where towering pines whispered with the wind, where rivers slipped silently through the mist, and where every path disappearing beneath the trees seemed to promise another story. So settle into a comfortable place, let the day drift gently behind you, and together, let us step into the ancient forests of the Slavs. If sleep finds you before our journey ends, don't worry. History has waited thousands of years. It will still be here tomorrow. Long before castles crowned the hills of Eastern Europe, before the first cathedral bells echoed across the valleys, there lived many peoples who shared a common heritage, language, and way of life. Today, we know them collectively as the Slavs. They did not belong to a single kingdom, nor were they ruled by one great king. Instead, they lived in villages scattered across an immense landscape stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Balkans in the south, and from the rivers of Central Europe deep into the eastern plains. Though separated by distance, they were united by familiar customs, similar languages, and a profound connection to the land around them. That land was shaped above all by forests. To the early Slavs, the forest was far more than a gathering of trees. It provided timber for homes, fuel for winter fires, berries and mushrooms in abundance, medicinal herbs hidden among the undergrowth, and game that sustained entire communities. Every season drew people beneath its green canopy, where mighty oaks, birches, and pines had stood for generations beyond counting. Yet these forests were not gentle places. A familiar path could vanish beneath fresh leaves. Thick mist could swallow the world in moments. Wolves prowled the shadows, rivers flooded without warning, and the silence itself often seemed alive. In such a landscape, it is perhaps no surprise that the imagination flourished as readily as the moss upon the ancient trunks. The changing seasons governed nearly every part of life. Spring marked the sowing of crops, summer brought long days of labor, autumn filled barns with the harvest, and winter gathered families around the warmth of the hearth. Living so closely with nature meant observing it carefully, yet there were still mysteries no one could easily explain. Why did travelers lose their way in forests they knew well? Why did certain lakes seem strangely still, while others claimed lives every year? Why did the wind sometimes sound almost like distant voices among the branches? Questions such as these rarely remained unanswered. Instead, they became stories. Unlike the Romans or the Greeks, the early Slavs left behind few written records of their own. Their history traveled not on parchment, but in memory. During long evenings, grandparents, hunters, and village elders passed stories from one generation to the next. Around the glow of a fire, children learned about the world through tales that blended wisdom with wonder. Some stories warned listeners to respect dangerous rivers. Others taught kindness toward neighbors or caution in unfamiliar places. Over time, these lessons became intertwined with extraordinary beings who seemed to belong as naturally to the landscape as the rivers and forests themselves. Each village told the tales a little differently. Names changed, details shifted, and new ideas took root, yet the heart of every legend remained remarkably familiar. Like the forests themselves, the stories continued to grow, sending new branches in many directions, while their roots remained firmly planted in the distant past. Over the centuries, many of these tales were finally written down by monks, travelers, and scholars, allowing them to survive long after the voices of the storytellers had faded. And it is those stories we shall explore together, not to ask whether such beings truly wandered beneath the trees, but to discover what these legends reveal about the people who told them. For every spirit, every monster, and every mysterious tale offers us a glimpse into the hopes, fears, and everyday lives of those who once called these endless forests home. If there was one place where the imagination of the early Slavs truly came alive, it was beneath the trees. A village ended where the forest began. Beyond the last cottage, where smoke no longer rose from chimneys and the sounds of daily life faded behind birdsong, another world seemed to unfold. Sunlight filtered through branches in scattered beams, the air grew cooler, and the scent of pine, moss, and damp earth lingered with every step. It was here, according to countless stories, that one might wander into the realm of the Leshy. The Leshy was among the most enduring figures in Slavic folklore. He was not a king, nor a god in the way many ancient cultures imagined their deities. Rather, he was believed to be the guardian of the forest itself, a spirit whose duty was to watch over the creatures, trees, and hidden places that lay beneath the canopy. Yet no one agreed on exactly what he looked like. That is perhaps what makes the Leshy so fascinating. In some villages he was described as a towering giant whose head reached the highest branches, striding silently through the woods as though he were part of the landscape itself. Elsewhere, he appeared as an ordinary hunter, dressed in rough green clothing, carrying a wooden staff, and blending so completely into the forest that he could stand only a few steps away without being noticed. Other tales claimed he could change his size whenever he wished. One moment he might loom as tall as an ancient oak, the next he could become no larger than a blade of grass, disappearing among the ferns without a trace. Many also believed he possessed the gift of transformation. He might appear as a wolf, a bear, a black bird, or even as someone familiar. A traveller could believe he had found a companion upon the path, only to discover that the stranger had vanished as quietly as the morning mist. Despite these many forms, the Leshy was rarely portrayed as purely evil. Instead, he reflected the unpredictable nature of the wilderness itself. Treat the forest with respect, and he might leave you in peace. Some stories even suggested he would guide lost children back toward their homes, or lead honest hunters to plentiful game. But those who hunted carelessly, cut trees without need, or mocked the quiet of the woods, risked drawing his attention. The punishment was seldom violent. More often, the Leshy delighted in confusion. A familiar path would begin to twist unexpectedly. Trees seemed to stand where none had been before. The sun disappeared behind thick clouds, though moments earlier the sky had been clear. A traveller might walk for hours only to discover they had wandered in a perfect circle, returning to the very place where they had first entered the forest. Modern readers may smile at such tales, yet they emerged from a very real world. Europe's great forests could be astonishingly disorienting. Without roads, maps, or landmarks, becoming lost was not merely inconvenient, it could be fatal. Stories of the Leshy offered an explanation for an experience many people genuinely shared. The old traditions also offered ways to escape his tricks. If someone believed the Leshy had led them astray, they might turn their clothing inside out, or place their shoes on the wrong feet. In some regions, making the sign of the cross was thought to break his enchantment after Christianity spread through Slavic lands. Older customs suggested speaking politely to the forest, avoiding unnecessary noise, or asking permission before taking what nature provided. Whether these rituals truly protected anyone mattered less than what they encouraged. They reminded people to move carefully through unfamiliar places, to respect the wilderness rather than conquer it, and to remember that the forest was never entirely theirs. Perhaps that is why the Leshy has endured for so many centuries. He was never simply a monster waiting in the shadows. He was the living spirit of the forest itself, a reminder that the ancient woods possessed their own quiet order, and that those who entered beneath their green roof were, for a little while, guests in someone else's home. While the forest belonged to the Leshy, every home was believed to have a guardian of its own. As evening settled over a Slavic village, and the last light faded beyond the fields, families gathered inside sturdy wooden homes. The day's work was finished. Fires crackled in clay hearths, bread baked slowly in warm ovens, and the scent of wood smoke drifted through the rafters. Outside, the forest disappeared into darkness once more, but within these walls, people believed they were not entirely alone. Hidden from sight, there dwelt the Domovoi. Unlike many figures of folklore, the Domovoi was rarely feared. He was thought to be the spirit of the household itself, quietly watching over the family, their livestock, and the home they had built together. If the Leshy represented the untamed wilderness beyond the village, the Domovoi embodied warmth, stability, and belonging. Descriptions of him varied from place to place, yet many shared familiar features. He was often imagined as a small, elderly man with a long grey beard, his face lined with age and wisdom. Some said his body was covered in soft hair, while others believed he resembled the oldest member of the family who had ever lived within the house. There were even tales claiming that each household's Domovoi took on a slightly different appearance, shaped by the people under his care. Few expected to see him clearly. If he revealed himself at all, it was usually in the quiet hours before dawn, or as a fleeting figure near the hearth, disappearing the moment he was noticed. More often, his presence was felt rather than seen. A creaking floorboard in the middle of the night, the sound of gentle footsteps when everyone else slept, or the comforting feeling that someone unseen kept watch over the home, were all signs that the Domovoi remained nearby. To many Slavic families, this was a reassuring thought. Life could be uncertain, crops sometimes failed, winters could be harsh, and illness often arrived without warning. In such a world, believing that a faithful guardian shared the home offered comfort during difficult times. Yet, like any good neighbor, the Domovoi expected to be treated with respect. One of the most common traditions involved leaving small offerings of fresh bread, porridge, milk, or salt near the hearth before going to bed. These gifts were not payment, nor were they acts of worship. They were simple gestures of gratitude, acknowledging the unseen protector who cared for the household alongside its human family. Bread held particular importance. Throughout much of Slavic history, bread was among life's greatest necessities. It represented hard work, nourishment, and survival itself. To offer even a small piece to the Domovoi symbolized generosity and trust, reminding everyone in the household that prosperity was something to be shared. Stories warned that a neglected Domovoi might become unhappy. Fortunately, his displeasure was usually more troublesome than terrifying. Tools might disappear only to be found moments later in the most obvious place. Animals could become restless in their stalls. Pots might tumble from shelves, or strange noises echo through the house after sunset. Such tales gently encouraged families to care for both their homes and one another, for harmony within the household was believed to keep its guardian content. Perhaps this explains why belief in the Domovoi became so widespread. Nearly every family hoped their home possessed one. Whether living in a humble cottage or a larger farmhouse, people found comfort in the idea that every hearth had its own silent keeper. The house itself became more than timber and stone. It became a place with memory, watched over by a spirit who remained as generations came and went. Even today, the Domovoi stands apart from many legendary creatures. He was not a beast to be defeated, nor a spirit to be escaped. Instead, he reflected something deeply human, the desire for home to be a place of warmth, safety, and family. Long after the fire had burned low and the doors had been closed against the winter wind, many believed that one faithful guardian still lingered by the hearth, keeping quiet watch until the dawn. If the forest inspired stories of unseen guardians, then the rivers gave rise to legends no less enduring. For the early Slavs, water was life itself. Rivers carried fish, nourished crops, connected distant settlements, and offered the easiest paths through vast landscapes where roads were few. Villages often grew beside their banks, and nearly every day began or ended at the water's edge. Yet rivers were never entirely predictable. A stream that sparkled gently beneath the morning sun could become a swift and dangerous current after heavy rains. Deep pools lay concealed beneath calm surfaces, and every generation remembered someone who had ventured too close and never returned. Water sustained life, but it also demanded caution, and so it became a place where the natural world and the unseen seemed to meet. From these waters emerged one of the most misunderstood figures in Slavic folklore, the Rusalka. Today she is often portrayed as a frightening ghost or a monstrous spirit that lures travelers to their doom. While such tales certainly exist, they tell only part of a much older and more complex story. In truth, the Rusalka was never understood in exactly the same way across the Slavic world. Among the Eastern Slavs, she was often imagined as the spirit of a young woman who had died before her time, her life unfinished, her presence lingering beside rivers and lakes. Elsewhere, particularly among some Western and Southern Slavic traditions, Rusalki were connected less with restless spirits and more with the living forces of nature itself. They were believed to dwell among streams, wetlands, and flowering meadows, embodying the vitality of spring and the abundance of fresh water. These differing traditions remind us that Slavic folklore was never a single collection of fixed stories. It was shaped by countless villages spread across thousands of kilometers, each adding its own voice to the tales passed from one generation to the next. One village might speak of the Rusalka with fear, another might remember her with reverence. This diversity is one of folklore's greatest treasures. The Rusalka was also closely tied to the changing seasons. In many regions, people observed a period known today as Rusal Week, celebrated near the beginning of summer, when fields were green, rivers ran full, and nature seemed almost overflowing with life. During this time, songs were sung, dances were performed, and certain customs honored the mysterious spirits believed to inhabit the landscape. These celebrations reflected an ancient understanding that life and death were never entirely separate. The same rivers that nourished crops could also claim lives. The same rains that filled the fields could bring devastating floods. Nature offered generous gifts, yet it always reminded humanity of its own power. The Rusalka came to represent this delicate balance. She was not simply a creature to fear, nor merely a spirit to admire. She embodied the mystery of water itself. Like many figures in Slavic folklore, she also carried quiet lessons. Children were warned not to wander alone near deep rivers. Fishermen learned to respect changing currents, and families understood that beautiful places could still conceal unseen dangers. Whether these lessons were told through practical advice or woven into stories of the Rusalka mattered little. Both served the same purpose: to protect those who listened. Even today, something about still water stirs the imagination. A lake at sunrise, untouched by wind, a slow-moving river reflecting the moon, the gentle rustle of reeds along the bank. Such places invite silence and reflection, much as they did 1,000 years ago. Perhaps this is why the Rusalka has endured. She reminds us that the natural world has always inspired both wonder and humility. To the early Slavs, every river carried more than water. It carried memory, mystery, and the quiet understanding that some places deserved to be approached not with fear alone, but with respect. And so, while the forests whispered of the Leshy, the rivers sang their own ancient songs, and among their gentle currents, the legend of the Rusalka continued to flow from one generation to the next. As the rivers wound their way through the valleys, and the villages rested beneath the shelter of ancient trees, there remained one place where few people willingly lingered. It was the deepest part of the forest. Here the sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Moss climbed over fallen trunks, roots twisted across forgotten paths, and silence seemed to gather beneath the branches like a living thing. To the early Slavs, forests were not empty wilderness. They were places where the familiar world gave way to mystery, where every step carried a traveler farther from the certainty of home. And somewhere within that wilderness, countless stories claimed there stood a most unusual house. It rested upon the legs of a great chicken. This was the home of Baba Yaga, perhaps the most famous figure in all of Slavic folklore. Modern stories often describe her simply as an evil witch, but the older traditions paint a far richer and more fascinating picture. Baba Yaga was never easily placed into the role of hero or villain. Like the forest itself, she could be generous or merciless, wise or terrifying, depending entirely upon the actions of those who sought her. She was often imagined as an elderly woman, her face marked by countless years, her hair wild as tangled branches, and her nose so long that storytellers delighted in exaggerating its size. She was said to fly through the forest, not upon a broom as later tales would suggest, but inside a great wooden mortar, pushing herself through the air with a pestle while sweeping away her tracks with a birch broom behind her. It is an image unlike any other in European folklore, and one that has remained unforgettable for centuries. Yet even stranger than Baba Yaga herself was her home. The little hut standing upon enormous chicken legs has puzzled scholars for generations. In the stories, it does not remain still. It turns as though alive, sometimes spinning slowly among the trees, refusing to reveal its doorway until the visitor speaks the proper words. Only then does the hut turn to face its guest, allowing them to enter. No one knows with certainty why the hut stands upon birds' legs. Some historians believe it may preserve memories of ancient wooden burial structures that were raised above the ground upon posts to protect them from wild animals. Others suggest the moving hut marks the boundary between the ordinary world and a realm of spirits, a place that cannot simply be entered without permission. Whatever its true origin, the hut reminds us that Baba Yaga exists upon a threshold. She belongs neither entirely to the human world nor completely to the supernatural one. This may explain why she behaves so differently from one tale to another. There are stories in which she captures careless travelers or punishes those who act with greed and arrogance. Yet there are just as many in which she offers wise advice, magical gifts, or impossible tasks that prepare a young hero or heroine for the challenges ahead. Those who arrive with courage, humility, and respect often leave wiser than when they came. In many ways, Baba Yaga is less a villain than a judge. She does not create a person's character, she reveals it. The forest surrounding her home carries much the same meaning. Leaving the safety of the village represents stepping into the unknown. It is a place where childhood gives way to adulthood, where certainty is replaced by difficult choices, and where wisdom is earned rather than given freely. Perhaps this is why Baba Yaga has endured for so many centuries. She reminds us that life's greatest teachers are not always gentle, and that the path to understanding often leads through places that first appear frightening. For the early Slavs, the old woman in the walking hut was never simply a monster waiting among the trees. She was the keeper of ancient knowledge, the guardian of forgotten paths, and the mysterious figure who stood at the edge of the known world, asking every traveller the same silent question. Who are you, now that you have entered the forest? The rivers of the Slavic world did more than shape the land. They shaped the lives of those who lived beside them. Before bridges were common, rivers served as roads, linking villages separated by forests and marshes. Fishermen cast their nets at dawn, merchants guided boats along slow-moving currents, and children learned from an early age that water deserved both gratitude and caution. A healthy river could feed an entire community. Yet the same river, after heavy rain or spring snowmelt, could become swift enough to sweep away even the strongest swimmer. It is perhaps no surprise that many Slavic peoples believed such waters had a guardian of their own. His name was the Vodyanoy. Unlike the graceful and often mysterious Rusalka, the Vodyanoy was usually imagined as an old male spirit whose appearance reflected the river itself. Folk tales describe him with green or blue skin, tangled hair resembling river weeds, and a long beard dripping with water. Some claimed his eyes shone like fish scales beneath the surface, while others said his body was coated in mud, algae, and reeds gathered from the riverbed. He belonged to the deep places where the currents slowed and the water grew dark. The Vodyanoy was not believed to wander far from his home. Instead, he ruled over rivers, lakes, ponds, and mill ponds, watching silently from below the surface. Many stories claimed he spent his days sitting upon submerged logs or smooth stones, waiting patiently beneath the water while fish swam through his unseen kingdom. His temperament, however, varied from one region to another. In parts of Russia, he was often portrayed as unpredictable and easily offended. Disturbing the water unnecessarily, shouting along the riverbank, or fishing without respect might provoke his anger. Stories told of tangled fishing lines, overturned boats, or sudden whirlpools appearing where the water had moments before seemed perfectly calm. Elsewhere, particularly in some areas of Belarus and Ukraine, the Vodyanoy was viewed less as a malicious creature and more as a stern guardian of the waters. Fishermen sometimes believed that if they treated the river with respect, the spirit might reward them with a plentiful catch. In this way, the Vodyanoy was much like the Leshy of the forests. Neither was entirely good nor entirely evil. Both reflected the character of the natural world they protected. Fishing itself was an essential part of life for many Slavic communities. Rivers provided food throughout the year, especially during seasons when hunting proved difficult or harvests were uncertain. Successful fishermen understood the habits of fish, the changing currents, and the weather. Such knowledge was earned through patience and experience. Alongside these practical skills grew traditions that blended daily work with folklore. Some fishermen quietly crossed themselves before launching a boat. Others avoided speaking certain words believed to bring bad luck. In a few regions, a small offering of bread might be cast upon the water before the first catch of the season, not as worship, but as a gesture of respect toward the river that sustained the village. These customs reflected something deeper than superstition. Rivers could be dangerous in ways that were often invisible. Hidden currents, submerged branches, slippery banks, and unexpected depths claimed lives long before warning signs or life jackets existed. A story about an unseen water spirit encouraged caution far more effectively than a simple instruction to be careful. Through folklore, practical wisdom became memorable. The Vodyanoy reminded people not to underestimate the river, no matter how familiar it seemed. Calm water could conceal powerful currents, and quiet pools often proved deeper than they appeared from the shore. In many ways, these stories reveal how closely the early Slavs observed the natural world. Rather than imagining nature as something to conquer, they understood it as a force deserving humility. Forests had their guardian, homes had theirs, and beneath the still surface of every river, people believed another silent keeper watched the waters, reminding all who approached that nature's greatest gifts were often accompanied by its greatest dangers. The forests, rivers, and quiet villages of the Slavic world were believed to be watched over by many unseen beings. Yet among all the creatures of their legends, none inspired more awe than the mighty dragon known as the Zmey. Unlike the dragons found in many modern stories, the Zmey was not always a beast of endless greed, sleeping upon mountains of gold. He belonged to an older tradition, one shaped by the skies, the changing seasons, and the forces of nature that lay beyond human control. Most tales describe the Zmey as an enormous serpent-like dragon with great wings and fearsome claws, but one feature appears again and again throughout Slavic folklore. He possessed more than one head. Three-headed Zmeys are perhaps the most common, though stories also tell of dragons with 6, 9, or even 12 heads. Defeating such a creature was never simple. In many legends, cutting off one head only delayed the battle, for another remained ready to strike. The greater the number of heads, the more powerful the dragon was believed to be. To the people telling these stories, such a creature represented a challenge beyond ordinary human strength. Across the Slavic lands, dragons were often linked with the heavens themselves. As dark clouds gathered and thunder rolled across the forests, it was easy to imagine colossal beings soaring unseen above the storm. Forks of lightning split the sky, fierce winds bent the trees, and rain transformed peaceful streams into raging rivers. Long before meteorology explained these events, many communities sought meaning through legend. In some traditions, the Zmey was said to command storms, while in others he battled celestial forces among the clouds. Every region offered its own interpretation, reflecting the landscape and beliefs of the people who lived there. The dragon also changed from country to country. In Serbia and parts of Bulgaria, the Zmaj, a close relative of the Zmey, could sometimes be a protector rather than an enemy. Certain legends even described dragons defending villages from destructive storms or opposing darker supernatural forces. Further north, particularly in parts of Russia and Ukraine, dragons were more often cast as dangerous adversaries who threatened kingdoms, demanded tribute, or carried away princesses. Poland developed its own rich dragon traditions. Perhaps the most famous is the legend of the Wawel dragon, said to have lived in a cave beneath Wawel Hill in Krakow. According to the best-known version of the story, the dragon terrorized the surrounding countryside, devouring livestock and frightening the people until a clever young shoemaker devised an unusual plan. He filled a sheep's skin with sulfur and left it where the dragon would find it. After swallowing the meal, the creature became desperately thirsty, drank enormous quantities of water from the Vistula River, and finally perished. Unlike many heroic tales, it was not strength alone that saved the city, but ingenuity. Across the Slavic world, dragons were rarely defeated by ordinary people. Instead, heroes stepped forward to face them. These champions often represented courage, wisdom, and perseverance rather than brute force. Their battles were not simply contests between man and monster. They symbolized the struggle against chaos, fear, and the hardships that every community eventually faced. Although Western European dragons are frequently portrayed as hoarding vast treasures inside mountain caves, the Zmey occupied a somewhat different place in folklore. Wealth was rarely his defining feature. Instead, he was more closely connected with power itself, whether that power appeared as violent storms, supernatural strength, or the unknown dangers lurking beyond the safety of the village. The Zmey reminds us that dragons were never imagined in exactly the same way across Europe. Every culture shaped them according to its own landscape, its own fears, and its own hopes. For the Slavs, the dragon was not merely a creature of fire and scales, but a force woven into the rhythm of the natural world, as immense and unpredictable as the thunderclouds gathering above the ancient forests. Not every story carried from the forests and rivers of the Slavic world was a warning. Some spoke instead of hope. After tales of hidden spirits, mysterious guardians, and mighty dragons, there remained another creature, one that seemed to belong less to the shadows and more to the first light of dawn. It did not lurk beneath dark waters or wait among ancient trees. Wherever it appeared, it was said to leave behind a single glowing feather, bright enough to illuminate the night. This was the Firebird. Unlike the Leshy or the Domovoi, the Firebird occupies a special place in Slavic folklore because it is not tied to one particular village or region. Instead, its legend spread widely, becoming especially beloved throughout Russia, while similar stories appeared in neighboring Slavic lands, each adding its own details to the tale. Descriptions of the Firebird are remarkably consistent. It is almost always imagined as a magnificent bird with feathers that shimmer like living flames. Gold, crimson, and brilliant orange ripple across its wings, while its eyes are said to shine like polished jewels. Even a single feather, should one fall to the earth, continues to glow long after the bird has flown, lighting the darkness without ever burning away. Its beauty is central to the legend. Unlike dragons or spirits that inspire fear, the Firebird awakens wonder. It represents something extraordinary, a glimpse of a world where beauty is rare, fleeting, and never easily possessed. In many fairy tales, the story begins not with the Firebird itself, but with one of its feathers. A prince or young traveller discovers this impossible treasure and is warned to leave it where it lies. Yet curiosity almost always wins. The feather is taken home, and before long, the ruler of the kingdom demands that the bird itself be found. Thus begins a journey across distant forests, mountains, and enchanted kingdoms, filled with challenges that test not only courage, but also wisdom and kindness. Curiously, the Firebird is neither entirely a blessing nor entirely a burden. Finding one of its feathers brings wonder, yet it also draws its discoverer into adventures they never intended to undertake. In this way, the Firebird reflects a theme found throughout much of Slavic folklore, that remarkable gifts often carry unexpected responsibilities. Many scholars also see the Firebird as a symbol of renewal. Its brilliant colors recall the rising sun after a long winter, while its radiant feathers suggest warmth returning to the land. For agricultural communities whose lives depended upon the changing seasons, such imagery would have carried deep meaning. Spring brought longer days, fresh harvests, and renewed hope after months of cold and darkness. The Firebird became a fitting symbol of that return. Over the centuries, these stories reached far beyond the villages where they were first told. Russian writers collected and preserved many versions of the Firebird's adventures, allowing them to become some of the best-known fairy tales in Eastern Europe. The legend later inspired painters, illustrators, and composers, each imagining the glowing bird in their own way. Perhaps the most famous artistic interpretation came in the early 20th century, when the Russian composer Igor Stravinsky created the ballet The Firebird. Filled with sweeping melodies and vivid orchestral colors, it introduced audiences around the world to one of the great treasures of Slavic folklore. Though the music belongs to a much later age, its inspiration reaches back to the quiet evenings when these stories were first shared around village fires. The Firebird reminds us that folklore was never only about explaining danger or warning against the unknown. It also celebrated beauty, hope, and the belief that beyond every difficult journey, there might still be something extraordinary waiting to be discovered. And perhaps, as dawn slowly breaks above the endless forests, with the morning mist rising from the rivers and the first rays of sunlight catching the treetops, one can almost imagine a flash of golden wings disappearing beyond the pines, leaving behind only a single feather, glowing softly in the light of a new day. As we have wandered through the forests, crossed quiet rivers, and stood before the strange hut of Baba Yaga, one question may have quietly followed us. Did the early Slavs truly believe these beings were real? The answer is not a simple yes or no. For many people living 1,000 years ago, the world was filled with mysteries that had yet to be explained. There were no weather forecasts to predict violent storms, no detailed maps of endless forests, and no scientific understanding of why rivers flooded or harvests sometimes failed. Life depended upon nature, yet nature often behaved in ways that seemed mysterious and unpredictable. Folklore helped make sense of that world. It gave a name to the unknown. Take the Leshy, for example. The forests of Eastern Europe were immense, stretching for hundreds of kilometers across lands where every tree could appear much like the last. Even experienced hunters sometimes lost their way. To say that the Leshy had turned the paths was not merely an attempt to explain being lost. It also reminded people never to become careless beneath the trees. The lesson was practical. Respect the forest. Pay attention. Do not wander alone. The same was true of the Vodyanoy and the Rusalka. Rivers were among the most dangerous places in medieval life. Hidden currents, deep pools, slippery banks, and seasonal floods claimed countless lives. Parents naturally wanted their children to keep a safe distance from the water, especially when no adults were nearby. A warning such as, "Be careful near the river," might soon be forgotten. A story about a mysterious spirit waiting beneath the surface. That would be remembered. Even Baba Yaga carried lessons beyond her unusual appearance. The heroes and heroines who entered her forest often succeeded not because they were the strongest, but because they were patient, respectful, honest, or willing to help others. Those who behaved with arrogance, greed, or cruelty rarely found a happy ending. Her stories quietly taught the values every community hoped to pass on to its children. The Domovoi reflected another important truth. For the early Slavs, the home was the center of life. Families lived, worked, and often welcomed several generations beneath the same roof. Believing that a kindly household spirit watched over the hearth encouraged people to care for their homes, honor their families, and value harmony over conflict. In many ways, these legends acted as teachers, not through rules written in books, but through stories. Modern psychology tells us that human beings remember stories far more easily than lists of instructions. Although the early Slavs would not have spoken in those terms, they understood the idea remarkably well. A child might forget a warning before the next sunrise, but they would remember the tale of the Leshy for years. There was another reason these stories endured. The Slavs left behind relatively few written records before Christianity spread through much of Eastern Europe. Their history, customs, and beliefs survived because people continued telling them. Around evening fires, during winter nights, and while working together in the fields, grandparents became teachers, and children became the next generation of storytellers. Each retelling preserved a small piece of the past. Some details changed. New characters appeared, old ones faded, yet the lessons remained surprisingly constant. Respect nature, care for your family, be kind to strangers, think before you act. Perhaps then we ask the wrong question when we wonder whether these creatures truly existed. A more interesting question is this: what do these stories tell us about the people who created them? The answer is quite a lot. They reveal communities that lived close to forests and rivers, depended upon one another for survival, observed the changing seasons with care, and sought wisdom not only in experience, but in imagination. Their legends were more than entertainment. They were maps for living, passed carefully from one generation to the next, ensuring that long after the storytellers themselves were gone, their voices could still be heard wherever people gathered to share a tale beside a warm fire. Our journey now brings us back to the edge of the forest. Behind us lie winding rivers, quiet villages, hidden paths, and ancient campfires where these stories were once shared beneath a sky untouched by city lights. Though centuries have passed since the first storytellers spoke of the Leshy, the Domovoi, the Rusalka, Baba Yaga, the Vodyanoy, the Zmey, and the Firebird, their voices have never fallen completely silent. Instead, they found new ways to be heard. As Europe changed through the Middle Ages and into the modern era, many old traditions slowly faded from everyday life. Christianity became firmly established throughout the Slavic world. Kingdoms grew into nations, and written history gradually replaced the spoken traditions that had carried these tales for generations. Yet folklore proved remarkably resilient. Scholars, writers, and collectors traveled from village to village, carefully recording stories that had survived only through memory. Thanks to their efforts, Legends that might have disappeared into history were preserved in books, allowing future generations to discover the rich imagination of the Slavic peoples. These collections soon inspired artists across Europe. Painters filled their canvases with moonlit forests and weathered cottages hidden among the trees. Illustrators brought Baba Yaga's curious hut to life, while composers transformed the radiant Firebird into music that seemed to shimmer with the colors of dawn. Ancient folklore, once spoken beside humble hearths, found its place in concert halls, galleries, and libraries. Today, these legends continue to inspire creators around the world. Readers encounter echoes of Slavic mythology in fantasy novels. Filmmakers borrow familiar characters and landscapes to create worlds that feel ancient and mysterious. Even those who have never heard the names Leshy or Domovoi may recognize the ideas behind them, woven quietly into stories that continue to capture the imagination. Video games have introduced these legends to an entirely new audience. Perhaps the best-known example is The Witcher. While its world is fictional, many of its creatures draw directly from Slavic folklore. The towering Leshy, the haunting spirits of the wilderness, and the atmosphere of isolated villages surrounded by dark forests all reflect traditions that have existed for centuries. The games do not simply copy the old stories, they reinterpret them, introducing millions of people to a mythology that was once known only through local storytellers. This continued fascination reminds us of something remarkable. Although technology has transformed the way we live, certain landscapes still awaken the same feelings they did long ago. A dense forest at dusk invites quiet reflection. A river disappearing into morning mist still carries an air of mystery. A lonely wooden cottage standing beneath towering pines can still spark the imagination. The world has changed, human nature has not. Perhaps that is why these stories remain so compelling. They invite us to slow down, to notice the beauty of the natural world, and to remember that every place has its own history, shaped not only by kings and battles, but also by ordinary people sharing extraordinary tales. The forests have grown quiet. The campfire has burned low. And though these ancient stories have been told for centuries, they still whisper among the pines to anyone willing to listen. Thank you for traveling with me on this short journey. If sleep found you somewhere beneath those ancient branches, don't worry. The stories will still be waiting when morning comes.